Germany, 1981. Inside a crowded courtroom, Marianne Bachmeier reached into her handbag and pulled out a pistol. 6 shots shattered the silence. Justice erupted in violence, and in that instant, a grieving mother shook an entire nation. Before the gunfire, before the courtroom, Marianne Bachmeier was just another woman in Lübeck, a northern port city of West Germany. Born in 1950, she grew up amid the slow rhythms of post-war recovery, where streets still carried the weight of rubble and silence. By the late 1972, she was living an ordinary life. She worked, paid her bills, raised her daughter. There was nothing in her story that foreshadowed the extraordinary path she would one day take. Her daughter Anna, just 7 years old, was her anchor and her joy. Blonde-haired, bright-eyed, endlessly curious, Anna filled their modest home with laughter. She was the reason Marianne woke each morning, the reason to endure every struggle. For a single mother in a conservative society, life was not always easy. But Marianne's devotion to Anna made the hardships bearable. Neighbors often saw them walking hand in hand along the banks of the Trave River, Anna skipping stones into the water while Marianne watched with quiet pride. On summer afternoons, they lingered at the small market stalls, Anna tugging at her mother's sleeve to ask for sweets. To Marianne, these small rituals were life itself, the everyday threads of love and normalcy. Behind her calm demeanor, Marianne carried the burdens of independence. She had endured the end of a marriage and the unspoken judgments that came with it, yet she refused to bend. Her daughter was proof that her choices, however difficult, had been worth it. It is important to see this Marianne, the mother before tragedy, because history too often remembers her only as the woman who fired a gun in court. She was not born out of violence. She was shaped by love. Every motherly gesture, every bedtime story, every moment of tenderness she poured into Anna would later stand in stark contrast to the horror that awaited them. For Marianne, life at this point was not a battlefield. It was fragile happiness, stitched together by the warmth of a child's smile. But fragile things can shatter quickly. And in March 1980, that fragile peace was about to collapse under the weight of a nightmare. Evil often hides in plain sight, wearing the face of an ordinary man. For Marianne, that evil took the form of Klaus Grabowski. Grabowski was not unknown to the authorities. He was a convicted pedophile, a man with a long history of abusing young girls. Twice he had been imprisoned. At one point, he had even submitted to chemical castration, a desperate medical attempt to suppress his compulsions. But the treatment was later reversed. Surgeons attempted to restore his masculinity with hormone injections. Instead of reforming him, the intervention unleashed the same darkness all over again. By 1980, Grabowski lived quietly in a modest home, keeping cats and projecting the image of a reclusive bachelor. Yet behind that facade lurked the same dangerous impulses. He was under probation, supposedly monitored, but the system that claimed to protect society failed to protect Anna. On the 5th of March 1980, Anna had a disagreement with her mother before school. Like many children, she acted on impulse and skipped class. As fate would have it, this small act of rebellion led her straight into Grabowski's path. He lured her into his home, trapping her in a nightmare no child could escape. What happened inside those walls can never be fully known, but the outcome is written in chilling detail. Grabowski, terrified that his fiancée would leave him if she discovered he had taken another child, chose to silence Anna forever. He strangled her, placed her small body in a box, and abandoned it near a canal. The discovery shocked Lübeck. A vibrant 7-year-old girl, gone in an instant. Her photograph appeared in newspapers, her smile forever frozen, her story forever unfinished. For Marianne, the loss was unbearable. Her daughter's life had been stolen not by illness or accident, but by the deliberate cruelty of a man who should never have been free. It was not just murder, it was betrayal by a justice system that had allowed a repeat offender to walk free, to hunt again. Klaus Grabowski's name became synonymous with horror. But for Marianne, it was more personal than headlines. He was not just a criminal. He was the man who had taken Anna's future, and with it, Marianne's reason to live. The stage was set, a grieving mother, a broken system, and a murderer who would soon sit smugly in a courtroom. The world would soon watch as grief transformed into something no law could contain. Grief has a sound. For Marianne, it was the silence of a house once filled with laughter. Anna's small shoes remained by the door, her toys scattered in corners, her drawings still taped to the walls. But Anna herself was gone, and that absence screamed louder than any voice. The news of her daughter's murder did not just wound Marianne, it hollowed her out. Friends remembered her as a woman who moved through the days like a shadow, her body present but her spirit distant. Simple tasks, making coffee, folding laundry, walking to the market, became unbearable rituals, reminders of the child who would never return. She sank into depression. Doctors described her as consumed by trauma, a woman adrift without anchor. Pills could dull the edges, but they could not bring Anna back. Therapy could offer words, but it could not mend the hole in her chest. Marianne often sat alone in the dim light of her living room, clutching Anna's photographs, asking questions that no one could answer. Neighbors tried to console her, but what comfort can exist when justice feels so slow, so inadequate? The legal system promised a trial. The newspapers promised coverage. Yet none of it touched the raw truth. Her child was dead, and the man responsible still breathed. Public sympathy poured in. Letters arrived, strangers offering condolences, strangers sharing their outrage. But sympathy did not replace justice. Sympathy did not erase the image of Anna's body stuffed into a box like something disposable. For Marianne, every day without a verdict felt like another betrayal. She lived in a kind of suspended animation. Time moved forward, but her life stood still. She replayed Anna's last morning in her mind endlessly, the argument before school, the childish defiance, the way the door closed. Guilt gnawed at her. If only she had held Anna back, if only she had walked her to class. 1,000 if-onlys haunted her. What does justice mean to a mother in such pain? To Marianne, it was no longer an abstract concept of laws and courts. It was something visceral, something she could almost taste, the longing for a world in which Anna's killer would no longer draw breath. And as the months passed, that longing hardened. It was no longer just grief. It was becoming something sharper, something the courtroom would one day witness firsthand. By early 1981, the case of Klaus Grabowski finally came to court. For the German public, it was a sensational trial. A repeat offender, a murdered child, and a grieving mother sitting quietly in the gallery. The courtroom in Lübeck was packed. Journalists crowded every corner, sketch artists filled their pages, and cameras outside flashed endlessly. The nation held its breath. The prosecution laid out the grim facts. Grabowski's history of child abuse, his prior convictions, his so-called medical treatments, his twisted fear of being abandoned by his fiancée. Each detail painted the picture of a man who had no business walking free. Each fact seemed to deepen the wound in Marianne's heart. She sat in the courtroom almost every day, her presence quiet but heavy. To the judges, she was another face in the gallery. To the reporters, she was the mother whose daughter's name had become headline fodder. But inside, Marianne was reliving her nightmare in excruciating detail. Every word spoken about Anna, every clinical description of her death, drove the knife deeper. The air in the courtroom was suffocating. Journalists later recalled how even seasoned observers felt uneasy. There was a sense that the trial was not just about one man's guilt, but about something larger, the failure of a system, the fragility of justice, the raw wound of a mother's grief. Grabowski himself sat in the defendant's chair, an almost ordinary figure. He was not monstrous in appearance, not visibly tormented by remorse. To Marianne, this was perhaps the worst part, that someone who had destroyed her entire world could look so calm, so indifferent. She studied his face, searching for even a flicker of humanity, but found nothing. Every mother in Germany seemed to see herself in Marianne. Newspapers debated not just the crime, but the meaning of parenthood, responsibility, and justice. Was the state capable of protecting the innocent? Or had it failed so profoundly that ordinary people could no longer trust the system? For Marianne, there was no philosophical distance. The trial was not an intellectual exercise. It was personal, agonizingly so. Each session was another step into the abyss of memory, another chance for her pain to be put on display. The trial had begun, but for Marianne, it was more than a trial. It was a slow torture, a daily confrontation with the man who had ended her daughter's life. And as the proceedings dragged on, something dark and decisive began to take shape inside her. Marianne sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, but her silence was not emptiness. It was a storm held behind closed doors. Every time her eyes landed on Grabowski, the memory of Anna returned in piercing clarity, her voice, her smile, her final mourning. The testimonies were brutal. Forensic experts described how Anna's life had been cut short, how her small body had been placed in a box and abandoned like refuse. The cold, clinical language of the court collided violently with the warmth of a mother's memories. Where the experts saw evidence, Marianne saw her daughter's last moments. Each word felt like a fresh wound. She clenched her hands in her lap until her knuckles whitened, trying to keep her composure. She wanted to scream, to demand that the judges look not just at the papers before them but at the gaping void this man had left in her life. But she stayed silent. The rules of the courtroom demanded restraint, demanded patience. Inside, though, she was unraveling. Friends who sat beside her remembered how her body seemed tense, rigid, as if she were holding herself together by sheer force of will. To them, she was a grieving mother. To herself, she was a volcano waiting to erupt. She studied Grabowski's face every chance she could. He did not appear tormented. He did not appear haunted by what he had done. He looked like a man inconvenienced by a trial, annoyed at the attention, almost smug. That indifference so casual, so cruel gnawed at Marianne's soul. The press portrayed her as a tragic figure, the grieving mother in the gallery, but the newspapers did not know the depth of her torment. They did not feel the nights when she lay awake replaying Anna's voice in her head, or the mornings when she could not bear to open her eyes because the world no longer contained her child. She tried to trust the system, but her faith was gone. How could she trust judges, lawyers, or doctors when all of them had already failed to protect Anna? How could she endure hearing her child's life reduced to evidence, her death reduced to procedure? As the days turned into weeks, Marianne's silence grew heavier. The storm inside her gathered force, and in that silence, a thought began to crystallize, a thought that would soon transform into action. The 6th of March, 1981. The trial continued as it always had, the judges presiding, the lawyers speaking, the reporters scribbling notes. But for Marianne, this day was different. The weight of her grief, her anger, and her disbelief in the system had become unbearable. She entered the courtroom carrying her handbag. To most, it looked like any other accessory, the simple item of a woman attending a trial. Inside, however, was a small pistol, a weapon she had decided would speak louder than any lawyer ever could. The air was thick with routine. Witnesses testified, papers shuffled, and Grabowski sat at the defendant's table as though nothing he had done was extraordinary. But Marianne's heart pounded in her chest like a drum. Her hands trembled, not with fear but with inevitability. At some point during the proceedings, she opened her handbag. To the casual observer, it was a small, almost unnoticeable gesture. But when her fingers closed around the pistol's grip, history shifted. She rose from her seat. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Then came the sound that would echo across Germany, the crack of gunfire. One shot, then another, then another. In total, 7 bullets were fired, 6 of them striking Klaus Grabowski. He collapsed instantly. There was no struggle, no final words. He was simply gone, the man who had stolen Anna's life now stripped of his own. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Reporters ducked for cover, lawyers screamed, police lunged forward, people shouted, stumbled, ran for the exits. But Marianne did not run. She stood rooted to the spot, her face pale, her breathing heavy but steady. She had done what she came to do. In that moment, the balance between law and vengeance shattered. Marianne had turned the courtroom, the very symbol of justice, into the site of her own justice. To some, it was an unspeakable violation. To others, it was the purest, rawest act of a mother's love. The echoes of those gunshots traveled far beyond the walls of Lübeck. They carried into newspapers, into living rooms, into the very conscience of a nation. Germany, and soon the wider world, would debate what had just happened. But for Marianne, there was no debate. Her daughter was gone, and now, so was the man who had taken her. She did not flee. She did not resist when the police closed in. The storm that had raged inside her for months had finally broken, and all that remained was silence. The courtroom still rang with echoes of gunfire when the police lunged toward Marianne. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered, witnesses pressed themselves against the walls. The very heart of justice had been transformed into chaos, and at the center of it all stood a mother who had just crossed the line from victim to vigilante. Marianne did not resist. The pistol slipped from her hand as if it no longer had weight. Her body seemed drained, almost relieved, as officers pressed her against the wall and forced her wrists into steel cuffs. She did not fight them. She had never intended to escape. Photographs from that day would become iconic. Marianne in a simple dress, her face pale but calm, her eyes distant, as if she were standing in two places at once, one in the courtroom, one still holding her daughter's hand by the river. That image, a mother in chains, burned itself into Germany's collective memory. The reaction outside the courthouse was immediate and polarized. Some called her a murderer, a dangerous precedent that threatened the very foundation of law. Others hailed her as a mother who had done what the system could not deliver: justice to the man who killed her child. In the hours following the shooting, Europe's media descended on Lübeck. Reporters swarmed the police station where she was held, broadcasting her story across headlines. Newspapers called her the avenging mother. Television anchors debated her act with voices trembling between shock and sympathy. For the German public, the case became more than a crime. It became a mirror. Could the law ever truly comprehend a parent's grief? Could any sentence handed down to Grabowski have matched the enormity of Anna's loss? Or had Marianne's bullets spoken the truth that legal language never could? Inside her cell, Marianne remained quiet. Witnesses said she appeared strangely composed, as if the storm had finally passed. She had carried her grief like a weapon, and now that it was released, she sank into a hollow calm. Yet the calm was deceptive. The real battle was only beginning, for if Marianne had found her justice in 6 gunshots, the law would now seek its own against her. When the doors of the courtroom opened again, this time it was not Klaus Grabowski in the defendant's chair, it was Marianne Bachmeier. The woman who had once sat quietly in the gallery now faced judges, prosecutors, and cameras as the accused. The charges were grave: manslaughter and illegal possession of a firearm. The state could not ignore what had happened. If the law was to mean anything, it had to hold her accountable, no matter the depth of her grief. But the trial was unlike any Germany had seen. It was not just a legal proceeding, it was a national reckoning. Supporters flooded the courthouse steps, carrying signs that read "Justice for Anna" and "A Mother's Right." Others denounced her, warning that if vigilante justice were tolerated, society would descend into chaos. Inside, the courtroom crackled with tension. The prosecution argued coldly. Marianne had taken the law into her own hands. She had planned her act. She had smuggled a weapon past security. This was not an impulsive outburst, but a deliberate killing. To allow such behavior, they said, would destroy the very principles of justice. The defense countered with a different narrative. Marianne was not a criminal, but a grieving mother driven beyond endurance. The state had already failed her by releasing a known predator into society. They asked, was it really Marianne who had broken the system? Or had the system broken itself long before she fired a shot? Marianne herself spoke sparingly, her voice subdued. She did not claim heroism, nor did she deny responsibility. She admitted what she had done. But in her quiet words, there was something haunting, the sense of a mother who had lost everything and acted not out of malice, but out of a pain too great for law to contain. Journalists scribbled furiously, their stories echoing across Europe. Television commentators framed her as both martyr and menace. Dinner tables across Germany erupted into debates. Was she a symbol of courage or a dangerous criminal cloaked in sympathy? The trial became more than Marianne versus the state. It became Germany versus itself, compassion versus order, grief versus law. And as the verdict approached, the nation held its breath once again, torn between the justice of the courts and the justice of the heart. The trial of Marianne Bachmeier stretched on for months, gripping Germany with an intensity few cases had ever matched. Every hearing was front-page news, every word dissected by a nation torn between sympathy and fear. Would the court show mercy to a grieving mother, or would it reaffirm that the law could never bend to emotion? When the verdict was finally delivered in 1983, the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The judges declared Marianne guilty not of murder, as the prosecution had demanded, but of manslaughter and illegal possession of a firearm. It was a decision that tried to thread an impossible needle, acknowledging her pain, but refusing to excuse her act. Her sentence was 6 years in prison. In reality, she would serve only about 3 before being granted early release. To some, this was mercy. To others, it was a betrayal of justice. The verdict reflected the divided soul of a nation. For her supporters, Marianne had already suffered the worst punishment imaginable: the loss of her daughter. How could prison add to a grief that would never end? They believed the court had struck a balance between law and compassion. But critics argued that the ruling was too lenient, that it sent a dangerous message. If personal vengeance could be forgiven, then what was to stop others from bringing their guns into courtrooms? Justice, they said, had to be blind, not swayed by sympathy or tragedy. Marianne herself received the sentence with quiet resignation. She did not protest, did not rage against the judges. In her heart, she had already passed her own verdict the moment she fired those shots. The prison bars that awaited her were heavy, but not as heavy as the coffin she had already buried. When she walked out of prison 3 years later, Marianne was no longer the woman she had once been. She had become a symbol, a story whispered in debates about justice, grief, and the limits of the law. But symbols cannot heal. Behind the headlines, she remained a mother who would never again hear her daughter's laughter. Marianne Bachmeier died in 1996, at the age of 46, after a battle with cancer. She carried her grief to the very end. Her act remains one of the most shocking moments in German legal history, not just because she killed her daughter's murderer, but because she did it in a courtroom where law itself was supposed to prevail. Some remember her as a hero, others as a criminal. But perhaps the truth lies in the question her life forces us to ask. What would any parent do, standing face to face with the one who destroyed their child's life? Marianne's gunshots were not just aimed at Klaus Grabowski. They were aimed at the silence of the system, at the unbearable gap between justice promised and justice delivered. And decades later, those echoes have not faded.